Okay, everyone, welcome back to the Contrarians, the most democratic channel on the YouTube rock criticism space. Disagree with me in the comments if you think there's another one that votes on all the topics. This is a Patreon suggested topic. We're doing how did you locate music pre-internet? Although I bet we're going to get into a little internet discussion too, because it's not like that's been one thing. So we're going to go around and everybody's going to give us their life history, and then we'll probably have some conversation. Let's start with Bill. Bill, how did you locate music before we got the internet?
All right, thank you, Reed. Before the internet, well, it started with my parents because both my parents are music lovers to this day, and they between them had a very large record collection and went to concerts, listened to the radio. This was through the 60s and 70s. And as a kid, I was always looking through their record collection even before I really started paying attention to music. So that was kind of my foundation. And it went on from there when I used what they had taught me or what I'd learned from their collection. I expanded upon that with friends who often gave me erroneous information. But I think we all know how that goes when people who love something but don't necessarily have any information that's accurate about it will kind of make things up, and we get all these cool myths about rock and roll that aren't even remotely close to true, but they're fun. So I got a lot of that from my friends along with the music recommendations. Later on into the 80s, I started using the Columbia House and BMG record and tape clubs, the mail order, 12 for a penny, buy a few more later at full price deal. I used those to get into things like alternative / college rock before alternative became a radio category. It got me into bands like the Pixies and the Sugar Cubes. And I did that based on the descriptions in the Columbia House and BMG catalogs. I'd never heard a note of any of them because I hadn't heard any good college radio stations. So I was just going on, okay, this sounds cool. Let's try it out. And I certainly was not hearing Black Francis or Bjork wailing on any radio station around my area at that time. But the very biggest by far, this is about as basic as it gets, but it was the radio. The radio was absolutely my friend. I mean, Queen said it in 1984. Everything I had to know, I learned it on the radio. And that's true. There was still back in the 80s and even into the 90s, I think disc jockeys were much more knowledgeable than, say, the folks that are on the clear channel stations and such now. These guys and gals all knew what they were talking about, more or less. At least it seemed to me they did at the time. I learned quite a bit from DJs back then, and it got to a certain point over the years as we got closer to the internet age. I found myself correcting the DJs and realizing that the people who were in that line of work no longer really knew what they were talking about or even really cared much about the music. And of course, the playlists on the radio station shrunk radically as they all kind of came under one ownership umbrella for the most part. Back even well into the 80s, there were some great radio stations here in the States. You never knew what you were going to hear. I mean, I could hear a metal song followed by some jazzy Sade song. I mean, the stations in the 80s, in Colorado especially, where some of those were awesome. And they brought me knowledge of both old and new artists. And yeah, that's true about all this. It wasn't necessarily about just discovering new music. It was about discovering older stuff and allowing me to get into those catalogs. Of course, now, thanks to the internet, I'm at the point where I don't really need recommendations from family or friends or disc jockeys or cover your ears, Martin, critics. The internet has made everything available. And if you have any sort of knowledge or interest at all in music, you can find whatever you're looking for pretty easily without anyone holding your hand. And that's both good and bad, of course. Back with all these former methods, it was a lot easier to focus. We've discussed it before in different variations on this channel that with the internet, of course, everything being available, it becomes difficult to focus on any one thing. And it's a shotgun approach. It's everything everywhere, and it can become overwhelming. So, yeah, there are pros and cons. I wouldn't go back at all. I absolutely love what the internet has brought, even with the downside. So, while I have fond memories of some of these old-fashioned things, yeah, you wouldn't catch me listening to the radio anytime in the last 20 years, as much as I absolutely loved it and cherished it as a teenager. So, as far as the subheadings on this title, we're talking about cover art, instrumentation, titles, that sort of thing. Those played a small part, but not huge. That would mostly come into play, say, in the bargain racks, the discount bins. If I had a few extra dollars and I wanted to rifle through and find some cheap records, in that case, yeah, cool cover art would get me, or say long song lengths, getting into the more progressive rock kind of stuff then. But yeah, radio was king. That is my final, hugest, most important answer. So.
Interesting.
All right, very good.
Nice.
I always forget about the Columbia House. My parents absolutely forbade me from joining Columbia House. They were afraid of it like it was a cult. I used to sit there with the catalog and go, but look at all these albums I would love to have. So anyway, good stuff. Thank you, Bill. Let's move to Dan from Off the Charts. Dan, welcome to the Contrarians. I don't know if you've been on a previous panel, but it's the first one I've done with you. So tell us about your...
my first episode here today.
This is the first one? All right, so welcome.
Excellent.
Well, so, I'm glad to be here. So I watch you guys all the time. For me, I would say, I mean, we all, like I said, like Bill said, regarding his parents, that's how I got introduced to music. Was it my tastes? No. But when you're living with your parents at 10 or 12, you listen to what they have. Radio, I never was a radio guy that much, so the first thing was, my neighbor introduced me to Kiss, Iron Maiden. This is back in 79, 80. And then when I moved to Ottawa, I used to live up north. I moved to Ottawa here, and I discovered a TV show called Video Hits with Samantha Taylor. That's where I got my pop, I guess. So and you had a few metal videos here and there, but it was very good. I watched it every day, but you're always hoping for that hard rock, because I was into hard rock by that time there, like 84 was like that's the type of music I'm like, okay, that's what I want. So Video Hits was the first step. Then I would say Power Hour, the Pepsi Power Hour, was where every Thursday we rushed home from school after, which is, for American friends, I don't know, it's like the equivalent to MTV's Headbangers Ball, by the way. So I'm from Canada. This is the Pepsi Power Hour. Every Thursday, they showed hard rock, metal videos, but it was still pay-per-view, so I had access to it. They used to give like free weeks once or twice a year. So that's sort of what I kind of knew. But my big influence would be this magazine right here. So Kerrang, we didn't really get that here. Anyway, from where I live, there was no Kerrang. Rip, not really. Hit Parader, we had that. What was the other one? Circus, which I like. So I'd like to thank my friend Steph, by the way, who actually gave me these props here. And we used to buy this. We called this the Bible, actually, because this had everything of what style of music we loved as kids. And like you'll see, you'll have a splash page of, like, for example, oh, look, there's a new Badlands album coming out. Well, that's what we went by. Like I said, Badlands was not on the radio here in Ottawa. So that was like kind of like, and that's how I like I said, I found out about new bands. I say, okay, this is the style of music that I like. The bigger the splash page, the bigger I'm like, oh my God, this must sound like great. And of course, you start to read up on these guys. And then of course, when Power Hour became part of the cable, so then I started watching that every weekend, because like Bill was saying, said they forbade him for something. my parents did not want to pay for the extra pay-per-view channels that we used to have here. So I relied on a few weeks per year when they unscrambled it for everybody. But then when it became part of the major cable, that's what I listened to that, like I said, every Thursday, and I discovered, and of course, back then we used to tape them on our VCR, like, okay, this is gonna be, looks good. So I'd be taping that, and then we'd do these little parties, I guess. We'd go to each other's houses and watch videos. That was what we did at the time. We were still young. So, and I guess third and last one would be being I guess 16 at the time. We didn't really have a job, so you couldn't really, whatever you could see in Metal Edge, you'd be like, okay, you go buy, let's say, a Bullet Boys album. You go, and I'll go buy the new Rat, let's say. We'd each go to each other's house. We'd go to our houses. We'll tape it, make the other guy a copy. And because you go with how much money you're making at the time, which was not a lot. Like I said, I started my first job at 16 at $5 an hour. So yeah, I'm showing my age there, but but yeah, it was Friends, Power Hour for me, and big time Metal Edge magazine for me. And there you go. That's how I found out about it. And then of course, like Martin's books there, The Riff Kills Man, my friend had that. I was like, the internet was 2 years away from that. So, but yes, like, I'm like, who the hell is Martin Popoff? Like I said, but it was good, like a good, well, I have these now there, like, like all 4 decades. And it was a good, whether we agree or not on the rating, it was a good way to find out what was existing out there. So there you go. That's my way of pre-internet getting my music.
Nice.
Okay, thank you
Excellent.
very much.
Very cool, Dan. Yeah.
All right. I've been wondering how big a part magazines and print were going to play in people. Martin, I'm going to leave you and I for last. Let's go down to Phil. Phil, how did you encounter music? Before, during, or after the internet?
Right. Okay. Well, thanks again for having me here. It's a great pleasure, of course, to chat with you guys. I loved everything I heard earlier from everyone, and I have to again, like, I often mention where I come from, and for me, it was very different with, let's say, the radio. I grew up on a small Greek island before finally leaving to go to mainland Europe. And there wasn't much going on the radio. There was practically nothing going on the radio. There was just one small local show that was called Stargazer, reference to Rainbow. And it would play a lot of like classic hard rock. It would never really play anything that was kind of current at the time. So it wasn't really, the radio didn't really play much of a role in steering me towards a certain direction. Then after that, you guys, Bill, you mentioned parents, and I'm grateful to my parents for how I've learned to appreciate Greek folk music, not the stuff that tourists listen to. An appreciation for jazz music and for classical. But then there's another category, and I'll mention a few more categories as we go through. There's the category of the sibling, the older sibling. And for me, it was really like there was some kind of trickle-down economy in relation to my older sister and myself, where anything that she would be listening to, and after a while she kind of got maybe bored of it, it would land on me, sort of. So around 96, 97, before really the internet started to gradually explode, I started listening to Metallica. I got a Iron Maiden single. Actually, I experienced in real time the first album by Iron Maiden that I experienced in real time, not album, single, was the Virus single, the first single released with Blaze Bayley on vocals. And that was thanks to my older sister who introduced me to that, because radio was not really influential. And then, yes, we had a few magazines. There was the Greek version of Metal Hammer, but I had somehow more, I paid more attention to what was written in a small Greek magazine called Metal Invader, which was ran by the editor of Rock Hard Grease Today, for which I am actually a writer. So that's a kind of funny anecdotal story. So anything that was in the local press and it was praised, and a bit like Dan said as well, if you would see a big like poster or whatever, you would just go to your local record stores, very small neighborhood record stores in my case, with thankfully a few metal and rock choices. And if it was available, I would go for it without having any idea what it sounded like, just go blindly. Or if necessary, you would order it. And I would actually remember I would order from Athens, from the capital city. I would order on the phone. I would actually call these bigger record stores that were sort of like chains, and I would actually order a CD. So after listening to the Virus single of Iron Maiden, I didn't know what to go for because I didn't know yet around 97, probably, when I was 15 years old, I think. Again, also revealing my age, although I'm much younger than everyone here. And I didn't know what album to go for. I didn't know what the discography of Iron Maiden was. So naturally, I did what most people would do, which would be to get a best of collection. I absolutely adore this, the Best of the Beast by Iron Maiden. It has lots of marks on it from time and from wear and tear, and I absolutely love this best of. And that kind of led the way forward, where you hear of this band called Deep Purple. Everyone knows Smoke on the Water already back then when I'm a young teenager, but I don't know their albums. I don't know which one to go for. You discover their discography and it's massive. So you're like, okay, I'm just gonna go for a anthology. So that became like a habit, getting into a best of CDs. I started playing guitar and getting heavily into blues and Jimi Hendrix. So I got into Stevie Ray Vaughan. I got his two notable best ofs as well. I've mentioned before Roy Buchanan as well, and then anthology again. I don't have any records of any other albums of Roy Buchanan. I just have this one anthology, and it has served me very well. So yeah, one category then is also best of collections. Same with Led Zeppelin, early days, latter days, which was a bit not such a good collection because you miss some of the really good deep cuts. That's one of the issues with best of collections. But anyway, that was one thing I did. Then the neighborhood record stores were really like a haven for me and a few other people. We would get there, we would hang out there. You would know and you would get to know better the owner, who kind of knew who you were, and he would sometimes like keep a CD for you on the side in case you would be interested. And one particular guy who I don't know where he is right now. His store, of course, closed more than a decade ago. He got me into Rory Gallagher. So I got loads of Rory Gallagher CDs. Some of them still have the price tag with the old Greek currency on it. So this one here, Against the Grain, has a price of 2,500 drachmas, which is something like $15 maybe. So record store suggestions were very important and influential. And sometimes if they would recommend, if the guy would recommend to you something like, I know you're a big prog fan, you would definitely like this. You should definitely buy this CD. You felt almost coerced into it. So I would sometimes buy certain albums without really having any idea what it is, just because this guy was like really adamant about it. You should really buy it. And I went for it. And sometimes I was disappointed. That's one more category. The other is some of your favorite bands, in my case, Dream Theater. They've had always many side projects. So I think, yeah, before the internet became huge, I discovered that they had a project with some members of Dream Theater called Explorers Club. Somehow I found them at the local record store, and I just went and got them because, hey, it's a Dream Theater side project. You got to get them all. Then a couple more categories. Label. So for some reason, in Greece, there were certain labels that were somehow maybe promoted largely by the press, and certain albums and bands that were critical darlings in Metal Hammer and Metal Invader magazine. And for some reason, many of them came from Noise International, a German label that went well, they were sold in 2001 to a bigger one, and then that one went bankrupt in 2007. So Noise International doesn't exist anymore, but they were basically to a large extent, responsible for releasing in Europe many German power metal bands, power speed metal bands like Halloween. And also, of course, the offshoot of Gamma Ray with Kai Hansen again. Lots of albums by Creator, Rage, another one of those German speed thrash power bands, Scanner, Sinner. And after a while, I thought, you know what? If you see the label Noise on an album, you probably know that it is a good quality German power speed metal. So I was totally into it at the time. I was really into Gamma Ray, Blind Guardian, Halloween, all these important bands. So if I saw the label of Noise, I totally went for that without any hesitation. And let me see. There were a few more. Here's another band that was a critical darling as well, and they became huge in Greece, and the press were constantly over them for some reason, really promoting. So after a while, it became almost fashionable that, if the magazine is praising this band to a good extent, then you should probably get their discography. And one such band that is not very popular is the British folk rock metal band Skyclad. And they were massive in Greece, and I got their entire discography over the years. And I actually really got into them, and I still love them very much. But I did that initially because simply they were constantly in the Greek metal and rock press. Same for so many other bands, but I will not go over them. And the last thing I want to mention is about peer pressure. So when I was in junior high school, especially my formative years in rock and metal music, there were a few kids at school who were into metal, and they were like their own little clique who were listening to the really extreme stuff, a bit like you see in that movie about black metal. I forget what it's called, where they all get together in their little cave, sort of, and they're listening to like Sodom and really extreme stuff, and they're all just headbanging together and hanging out and drinking beer or whatever as young delinquents. And so I was hanging out with this group of other young metalheads, and I really liked hanging out with them because you felt that you belong and you're not all the time just being bullied for being, Satanist, as they called me. But they were all listening to extreme death metal, to black metal. And I never really got into black metal, but because of them, I went and bought a whole bunch of Cradle of Filth albums and Dimmu Borgir albums. And somehow, at the time, as a teenager in the late 90s, early 90s, I convinced myself I really love this stuff. Oh, I love Cradle of Filth. Oh, I love Dimmu Borgir. Oh, I love, I don't know, any other offshoot band of these like sort of Norwegian or British black metal bands. And turns out I didn't love them. So at some point in the noughties, I kind of got over this idea that I have to love extreme metal, especially black metal, because of my friends. And I eventually sold all these albums. And since then, I don't really listen much to black metal. It's not my thing. So yeah, those are my categories. And I'll see what else Rand has to say as well. Yeah.
Nice. Excellent.
All right.
Thanks, Phil.
Thanks, Phil.
Very cool.
Yeah. Having a vendor who knows your tastes or thinks he knows your tastes, that's the original version of the algorithm, right?
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Okay. Well, Rand, since you've joined us, I'm going to have you go next. You are on mute.
Hey, I'm sorry I'm late. Thank you, Martin, for the.
No worries, Rand. Glad to have you. I was making a joke that you were going to tell us about buying wax cylinders, but I realize I'm almost as old as you are, so I'll be talking about wax cylinders too. So
Edison Schmedicine, right? So does anyone know who thought this up?
I don't remember. Not
It's
sure.
me.
Oh, was it you?
Oh.
Okay.
Yeah,
Cool.
yeah, I came up with it because I'm 71, and I was thinking, oh, I got a good contrarian thing. How about before the internet, and how were people buying records? And I have stories. Oh, I have so many stories. But anyways, if I just do it chronologically, because it's all going to be in my head and I'm not using props, but I do wear my King Crimson shirt today, so
Yeah.
that's part of it. But yeah, anyways, yeah, I can remember going into a listening room in Sacramento. I wanted to check out a Beatles single called Ticket to Ride, and Yes, It Is. And I bought it for $1. And you could go into these rooms and just shut the door and just play records. You know, it was amazing. But they shut that down because people started going in there and bringing their lunch in there and they're hanging out. And you couldn't get in the room because nobody wanted to leave. So those disappeared. But that was at Tower Records. And Tower Records was probably my biggest source of music. You know, but I didn't live in Sacramento at that time. I was just visiting there. I'm from Eureka, California. We didn't have a tower in Eureka. So every time we went down to see a band in the Bay Area, we would always go to a Tower Records. It was either San Francisco or Berkeley. And this was before Amoeba and all that, you know. But anyways, you just go in and it was, the categories were like not there. You know, these are the early days, right? Like after I got out of the Air Force in like 1973 and stuff like that. The categories, you just walked in and it was like A to Z. You just like go through and I knew what kind of music I liked. You know, as a Beatles fan, I was already into Yes, I was already into King Crimson. So I would look for albums like that. But the first thing I had to do was go by the album cover, the artwork. That was helpful. Then I would turn the album over and see who was in the band, if I recognized any of the names. Of course, I didn't know that much because if you wanted to find anything out, you had to buy Hit Parader, Circus, Cream Magazine, Crawdaddy, things like that. I bought those all the time. And what I would do is get to know these guys that were selling the records and ask them if I could borrow the billboards and the cash boxes and just sit there and read like crazy and find out what was coming, what people were saying about, you know, in the industry and all that. It was real helpful. And then also, like I've said, on the back of the album cover, me being a musician and already liking what was going to be called prog, but at that time, there really wasn't a label for it. People were calling it classical rock and art rock kind of thing. You know, like bands like Emerson, Lake and Palmer were just befuddling most people. And yes, and Genesis and stuff like that. So what I would do is I'd look on the back of the album, and if it appealed to me in the artwork part, like let's say Genesis Live, for instance, that cover just really attracted to me. I don't know why. But you look on the back of the album and you look at who's playing what, you know, and me being a musician, already into keyboards, I'm buying everything with the word synthesizer or Moog on it, you know, and Mellotron. Those were big, big, big factors for me. I was trying all these bands out. That's how I got into Pavlov's Dog. A lot of people don't like Pavlov's Dog because of the singer. I went and saw them open for Nectar in Berkeley. I thought they were fantastic. But you look on the back and you see, I saw Mellotron and Moog. I'd buy it just straight up. And 9 times out of 10, it was a good choice. But these are the kind of things. What was some of my other categories? I forgot what I said.
Oh, did instrumentation, front covers? What else?
Yeah, I've already got. Yeah.
Yeah.
What was the other label? Yeah, label was another one too. Like if you bought one band, like say Genesis on, well in America they weren't on the famous Charisma label. They were on like a company called Buddha. But when you go to the import section, and I was buying 8-tracks, and there's no information at all on 8-tracks. So I have to go over to the record store and learn everything, and then come back and buy it on 8-track. But they were right next to each other. So when I'd buy like Genesis, say, and it was on the famous Charisma label, and then I saw Van de Graaff Generator was on the famous Charisma label, then I would kind of like gravitate towards that, just because, well, if they're on that label, then this other band must be just as good. You know what I mean? And you try things out like that. So label is important. I remember Capitol Records was a big deal for me because that's when I got my first Gentle Giant album, was The Power and the Glory. And oh God, that album just knocked my socks off. I just couldn't believe how good it was. To this day, I can't play but one song on there, Aspirations, because it's simple. But they were on Capitol, and I mean, oh my God, you know. So it was just one of those things that you had to just take a lot of chances, but I got lucky. And I used my head, I think, to gain knowledge so I wouldn't get burned, because I didn't buy a lot of albums where I got home and I went, oh God, this sucks. That might have happened 5 times in my life. And then it was still pre-internet, but it was the 80s in Eureka there. And there was a store called The Works, and I went there. I spent a fortune in that store. But it was like it was getting harder and harder to find what I liked, progressive rock. It was just disappearing. And this was just about the time Marillion came out. So I saw the Marillion cover for Script for the Jester's Tear, and I thought, well, no, that's not true. Let me back up. There was an import single called Market Square Heroes, was not on the album that they were going to release. But we ended up buying that 12-inch, me and my best friend Bill. And that really got us into searching for the new wave of British progressive rock, But what happened was that all just kind of petered out. I got into all those bands, Marillion, IQ, Pendragon, and stuff like that. And then that all just became really either hard to find or they weren't doing anything. And it was just like a drought in Prague, progressive rock. So ended up starting to buy heavy metal. And I really wasn't that big a fan, but like Philippe was talking about Iron Maiden, my first Iron Maiden was the first Iron Maiden album. And it was like, holy crap, this is really good stuff. And then I'm reading about the band, and Steve Harris comes out and says, oh, well, my favorite bass player is, my favorite song of all time is Supper's Ready by Genesis. And I went, yes.
And his favorite bass player was Chris Squire.
Right. But But it's just like, and then I meet this guy there at the Works, and he turns me on to Ride the Lightning by Metallica. And I had never heard Metallica because Kill 'Em All just passed me by. I didn't see any reason to get it because I didn't like the cover. I went, oh God, that looks like blood. Why would I want that? But anyway, the guy that turns me on to Ride the Lightning by Metallica is a dude named Mike Patton. And we became fast friends before he became absolutely phenomenally famous. And he was listening to, he goes, I've been listening to this for 2 weeks straight. I can't pull it off the turntable. And they're in the record store where he worked, they would allow, the employees to play the records. So he was getting ready to switch the album over for at the time when he was talking to me, and he goes, check this out. And he put on Trapped Under Ice, and my jaw just dropped. I just like, oh my God, this is awesome. I said, how do these guys do this? So that was another thing. Getting to know the people that sold the records was real helpful. And we became fast friends until he left Eureka and went down and joined Faith No More. But what was another one of my things? Did we get them all? Or
I think
the only other one you had was Tidal.
Oh yeah, Tidal. Yeah, I remember looking at song titles, going, I don't think that'll be good. It was just. It was weird, I mean, I might have shut myself out of some really great music just because I was prejudiced against either the artwork or the song title or the band title. I mean,
would you ever buy an album? Would you ever buy an album that has a title of a song like Supper's Ready? I mean, what is that?
Well, yeah, it is weird. But the thing is, here's the deal. When the American releases came out, they weren't the same as the imports. The Genesis album, Foxtrot, and Nursery Crime was a single slide-in record. There was no gatefold. You didn't have all that beauty that I ended up seeing when I bought the import. You know what I mean? And so, and also you pull out the record and there's no lyrics. It's just one of those paper sleeves. So that takes away your experience. But you don't know it's taking away your experience until you run into the import album. So it was kind of weird like that. But a lot of the bands did that, and they got these record contracts in America that were just totally weird compared to what was going on in other countries, like over in Europe and stuff like that. Yeah, I probably covered all that, I guess. Cool. But so the internet came out, and it was just like, oh my God, are you kidding me?
Yeah.
This is amazing. It just changed everything.
Yeah. Excellent. Nice.
Okay, Rand, thank you very much.
Thank you, Reed.
Martin, you are next, sir.
Okay, I just realized I've never really thought about this much. You guys have brought up some great points, and it just dawned on me that the theme of my answer is going to be we didn't have any sources of anything because when I add up, Bill talks about radio. When I think about radio, I think I can't think of any examples of something where I was turned on to something by radio. Video is a later thing, so I want to stick to kind of the mid 70s here. But then I'm thinking like we were always reading the magazines, right? Circus, Cream, Hit Parader, over and over again, Rolling Stone, whatever. Later it was Sounds and Kerrang. But the fact of the matter is I can't think of any examples, but generally speaking, we're reading these magazines front to back, but we've already taken a risk on those albums. We've already bought them, right? Occasionally there would be an ad for something that you haven't seen yet, but generally speaking, the records were out by the time you read articles on these bands and stuff. So that isn't really a source. Older cousins like Tim and Joe and Lawrence and older brother of Forrest Tube, Mark Tube, a little bit. I can think of 3, 5, 6 albums, bands. So there wasn't much there. So essentially what happened was, so it wasn't radio, wasn't video, wasn't really the magazines, even though we knew everything. We learned a lot. We enriched ourselves about these bands through the magazine. So it was going to the store. And as Rand says, so we're buying only heavy stuff. That's all we cared about, right? So it was like, how violent is the band name? How violent is the album cover, the title? Turn it over. Look at that. Look at the song titles. Make sure that boogie isn't mentioned in the title. Blues, no women's names. Look at the instrumentation. No flutes. No keyboards. Definitely no string arrangements. I remember you guys bring up some things that reminded me of this. So occasionally there was the odd, cool hippie head shop record store that would have a turntable off in the corner and you could play stuff. So there was a bit of that, but not a lot. There and Rand brings up a good point there too. Sometimes people would hog it, and then then the store would put on a limit. The other thing that's similar to that is you could cajole the hippie running the place to play something for you. That happened a fair bit, right? But not a lot. I mean, I'm now remembering a few times. Sometimes you'd walk into a store and they would just be playing cool stuff. So there's a little bit of that. The guy behind the counter looks so cool to you. He's like a god, right? He's like a 25-year-old long-haired hippie guy who gets to work in this store. Like, how cool of a job is this, right? At Strawberry Jams or Magic Mushroom or Eucalyptus in Spokane, Washington, where we go. That was our main shopping Shangri-La. But also you would, there'd be all this risking on new releases at $4.99, but there would also be lots and lots of, we bought a lot of used records, right? So now you're down into that $2, $1, $3 range, right? And a lot of the used records you would buy at that time were the cutouts that were sold to the store by the radio station guy. So we'd buy a lot of stuff with the clipped corners of various types, right? The 5 different famous clipped corners, right? So buying used records didn't mean you were buying old records. Sometimes you were buying things even before they got the new release in. So we would buy lots of new releases for $3, right? So your risk wasn't as bad. The other thing you would do is you would take the record out, and if it's a used record, you would take the record out and look at it. And if the grooves were dark, it was quiet. If the grooves were white, it was loud. The whiter, the louder. The whiter, lighter gray that those grooves are, the louder those songs are, right? And you realize I got something heavy here or not, right? Generally speaking, if you see something banded with a lot of black, white, you knew they weren't a heavy. It was just kind of getting a little loud for a part there. They're writing epics, whatever, right? This is the metalhead version where we're not looking for the long songs and the different darknesses of the grooves, right? And Rand, you brought up a point that I totally forgot about too. Sometimes you could read the lyric sheets, right? And you could tell how heavy it is. But yeah, it had to be 4 long-haired guys, 5 long-haired guys, no women in the band, guitar, bass, and drums, nothing else. And then you knew your risk was going in the right direction, right? But it's funny as you guys say all this. I'm thinking of all these sources out there. And none of them helped us. None of them. We already had the album. We already took our shot. before we read about them in almost every case. And then you get up to the new wave of British heavy metal. And I remember, so that starts not with Kerrang, but with Sounds. Sounds was the one that had the most metal in it, right? But when we walked into Spokane, because Spokane's in the States, it's a different country, and we're in Canada, it's 2 hours and 15 minutes away. You'd only go, once every 3 to 4 months kind of thing, right? So you'd walk in, you'd buy two copies of Sounds, but fact of the matter is now, there was a metal language and a metal, there was metal illustration, there was the metal uniform, there was a metal genre, new wave of British heavy metal. It was going to turn out to be pretty heavy anyways. But so you were buying the Sounds, but you weren't reading it to see what I should buy. You were just taking it home, along with the 3 or 4 or 5 records that you risked. Now we're talking $8.99, $7.99, $9.99 import copies, right? But by that point, you had a better shot, because in the 70s, as I've said many times, the Eagles looked just like Black Sabbath. They all look the same, right? They all dress the same. They look the same. Their hair, the mustaches, all that stuff, right? So, yeah, it's pretty interesting how, and speaking again to Rand's point, we did get burned quite a bit. Because we were so curious, we would go that extra layer where we knew we were in a risk zone where this may not be very heavy, right? And I famously talk about Bob Seger and REO Speedwagon albums looking heavy and stuff, right? Black Oak, Arkansas looked heavy, they weren't. Grand Funk looked heavy, they weren't. We did occasionally get burned, but generally speaking, no, you were in pretty good shape. But yeah. That's all I got to say. Those were our methods in the early days.
Okay, very good. All right, well, as per my normal procedure, I've left myself here for last, and I'm going to kind of divide it up into decades, because it was a very different experience for me in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. Now, in the 70s, I was a kid. The easy way to think of it, in the 70s, I was a kid. In the 80s, I was a teenager. And in the 90s, I was a young adult. But as a child, I was an omnivorous music listener. I started listening to music seriously very young, about 7 years old. But I did not own music of my own. I was dependent on just whatever was in the environment. And I had a friend who, I've told this story on other videos, but I had a friend whose parents ran a little, what was called a dime store at the time, but they sold records. And he used to bring home everything. But he was a huge Kiss fan. So he introduced me to Kiss and the Bay City Rollers, and his parents loved all sorts of rock. They listened to Black Sabbath. I remember listening to the
excuse
original...
me for a sec. Would he bring stuff home? He'd buy everything, but it would be sealed and they'd unseal it, or what?
Yeah, his parents would basically give him a copy of something whenever they got it into the store. So he had Fleetwood Mac Rumors, I remember, was a big one. The first Black Sabbath album scared the hell out of me, and I wouldn't let him play it after the first time. Again, I was like 7 years old, right? So it was just whatever. And then I had an uncle that I saw about once every 3 years that he was into rock, and I would listen to his 8-tracks. So in the 70s, I didn't really have a musical taste. My parents bought me 2 Kiss albums. They bought me Rock and Roll Over and Love Gun, and then decided that they didn't really care for that. But they bought me the Beatles and the Beach Boys because they thought those were safe. So I listened to Kiss, the Beatles, and the Beach Boys in the 70s, and then just whatever anybody else around me was listening to. Or, to think of it another way, it was word of mouth, because I listened to whatever my friend liked and had kept from the voluminous records that his parents had given him, because he didn't like everything, right? He would just keep the ones he liked, although he had pretty broad tastes. In the 80s now, I have moved to a small town in Montana. There's no pop culture exposure until MTV hits in 1982. And MTV becomes unquestionably my source for music. And even though by then I had become a heavy metal fan, I loved anything that was on MTV. So you could find heavy metal on MTV. It wasn't just during the Headbangers Ball. Now, they played it at weird times, But remember, about 1984, heavy metal became a very dominant rock music form, and they were always playing videos by Def Leppard and Quiet Riot and Motley Crue. But I also saw videos by Iron Maiden and Dio and the Scorpions and Megadeth. Of course, Guns N' Roses started to get big as I went off to college. So I was away from MTV by this point. But I was going to say the other thing, it's still word of mouth. I did not read the music magazines, but I had another friend who did. And he would buy whatever the new hotness was. So he was a huge Judas Priest fan, but outside of that, he would buy everything he could get his hands on. If it was in Circus or Hit Parade or Mag, I don't remember Metal Edge being there in the early 80s, at least in our little stores in Montana. But whatever was in Circus or Hit Parade, he would buy those. So that's where I got to hear things like Poison and Rat and Dokken and strange stuff like Loudness, the Japanese metal band who I absolutely love. And Savatage and Warrior, who just had out the one album that's super cheesy, but I freaking love it. They have more albums out now, but they only had one album out for like 15 years. But I was also listening to pop music like Duran Duran and David Bowie and The Cure because it was on MTV. So in the 70s, it's word of mouth and availability. In the 80s, it's MTV and word of mouth. By the 90s, I've moved to a large market in Oklahoma City. They have a rock radio station, and I think of the 90s as my decade of the radio. Whatever was on the radio, I would listen to. And at this time, remember in 92, Metallica's Black Album comes out, and suddenly the radio, just regular old rock radio, is playing heavy stuff that you can't imagine them playing in the 1980s. Now, that only lasts until about 96. But nonetheless, for those 4 years, they're playing Ozzy Osbourne on the radio. They're playing Alice in Chains and Guns N' Roses and Metallica and Soundgarden and all of these really heavy bands. So I would hear songs. I only live 3 blocks away. This is the American experience. Somebody walks. I lived 3 blocks from work and I drove. But during that 3 blocks, I would hear a band and I would just drive right to the record store and go, hey, I heard this song on the radio. Who is it? And they'd be like, oh, that's Facelift. It's right over there, Alice in Chains. And I would take it home. And, you know, about half the time, it would turn out that the only song I liked on the album was the song on the radio. So I got burned a lot. In the mid-90s, this is one that nobody else brought up. So when I met my wife was the only person I met who was as addicted to music videos as I was. But by now, MTV no longer played music videos. They were a lifestyle channel. They were doing like MTV Cribs and I don't even remember what else. But they weren't playing much in the way of music videos. So my wife had subscribed to a VHS service. I tracked down a couple of it called Rock Video Monthly. And so every month she would get a videotape that had a dozen videos on it and a magazine that went with it. And when we met, she asked me what kind of music do you listen to? And I said, well, I listen to heavy metal. So she changed from their alternative rock, this is an alternative rock tape, their heavy metal service. And here, I'm going to read some of the bands on this because most of these you'll have never heard of, at least I hadn't. The Wolfgang, this is the alternative. The Wolfgang Press, Our Lady Peace, I've heard of them. Rusted Root, Fret Blanket, I actually like Fret Blanket. Dead Eye Dick, The Cramps, heard of that one. Censor, Everclear, Sinead O'Connor, and Korn. So they could clearly only afford the rights to 3 or 4 known artists and then a whole bunch of non-entities. Here's their heavy metal. Megadeth, Ugly Kid Joe, Channel Zero. Any Channel Zero fans out there? I've never heard of them. Anna Miniature, Crowbar. I do like Crowbar. Steve Vai, Meshuggah, Plastic Noise Experience, Engine 88, and Dismember. So again, a mix of names and who, but it was really the magazine now. And this is where I heard of bands like Nevermore and Iced Earth and Death. I had heard of Death, but I was not a death metal fan, but they said you should really check out Symbolic. So I got Symbolic, and I do like the later period Death because it's much proggier, for lack of a better word. And this was also the only time where used CDs were such a huge part of the music market. So rather than paying, you know, 10, 12 bucks for a new CD, I would go to the used CD store and get 3 for 1 for the price, right? And at that point, that was the first time in my life where I was flipping through the racks, and I would just go to the metal section and go, okay, Overkill. I know of Overkill. I've only heard a few songs. I'm going to buy 3 used Overkill CDs and take them home. And of course, by now I was an adult. I had a job and some expendable funds. So I would just buy music and take it home. So I was trying everything. So I almost view those magazine reviews, though, as another form of word of mouth, because it was a reviewer talking about whether they liked the music. And I know, Martin, you've talked about the value of critics in the past. The value of a critic, for me, you have to know where a critic comes from. Because anybody can say, this is good, this is not good, and you have no idea what that means. But you read a dozen reviews from somebody, and you get a picture of what do they mean by good, and you find the critics whose opinions that you agree with. Maybe you've been burned a couple of times, bought something they said was awesome, and you're like, oh, this sucks. And you find the ones that you don't agree with so that you can not do what they suggest. And that's why I try to give a little detail on these videos, because if anybody's going to take my suggestions, they need to know where I'm coming from. But that gets me back to, I'm going to mention the internet for a little bit, mostly in the form of YouTube. Nothing has changed my music listening experience like getting involved with the Contrarians. I can't tell you how many bands in the past 3 or 4 years I have picked up because other Contrarians loved them. And you hear somebody talk, it's different to read about it, because reading is very clinical, even if somebody uses very flowery language. But when you see somebody talking about it and you can see the passion that they have for this music, you go, yeah, man, I need to check that out. And it's not always great. It's not always my thing, but I have found some absolutely wonderful bands that way. And if anything, I hope the Contrarians turns on other people to awesome music too.
Nice.
And that's my bit.
Hey, Reed, before
Yeah.
we go, can Martin brought up a point that I forgot to mention. He mentioned Kerrang. I bought Kerrang every time they came out. I bought every one of them, and I just recently sold them all because I was never going to look at them again. But anyways, it was helpful to me with Kerrang because when they talked about progressive rock or prog or whatever, there were certain guys that liked it there, and there were certain guys that didn't like it there. And you would think that it'd be more helpful to find a guy like, say, Malcolm Dome was really into pomp. And that's how I found out about pomp bands, that style of, it kind of like everybody was copying Asia is basically what it is. But what I found out, there's a reversal idea that I thought of myself, because there was this guy, they had a reviewer named Howard Johnson, and never forget him, because he hated prog. Hated Yes. Of all the bands that he talked about, he hated Yes the most. So when he was talking about bands like Multi-Story or Palace or whatever, and he would say, these guys are so awful, they remind me of Yes, boom, I'd buy it. So he was so helpful to me because everything he hated, I loved. So I bought a lot of albums because of Howard Johnson putting them down. That probably isn't very widely known. I mean, I thought.
And that makes you a bit of a contrarian.
It's a very contrarian, but it was so helpful because I did get it. I got into It Bites that way. They did a big article on It Bites, the big lad in the windmill, and getting back again to Mike Patton. I had bought that album and I said, man, you got to listen to this. This is amazing. And I loaned it to him for a week. And he loaned me a cassette tape called The Raging Wrath of the Easter Bunny by Mr. Bungle. And they're from my town. They came out of the high school that I graduated from 5 years earlier or whatever. But anyways, no, 15 years earlier. Sorry. But anyways, it was like there were so many avenues that I was trying to find any way I could find, when he mentioned Kerrang, I went, damn, I forgot to mention that. Okay, well, anyway, that's it.
Nice.
It's funny. You could not get Kerrang anywhere I was at. I didn't know it was a magazine. I used to listen to Manowar, and they have there's a lyric once about he's putting an ad in the back of Kerrang, and I used to go, what the hell is that? Anyway.
Well, everybody
okay.
thought they were a heavy metal magazine, but God, you walk in and see Fish on the cover. Big, huge article about the bands that were like coming up with Fish on the cover, and they were talking about the new wave of British progressive rock. I call it the second tier or the second level or whatever, and they were so helpful. I actually kept that one, but yeah, that's enough.
Okay, and maybe someday we'll do a whole show on modern music journalism. Who knows? If you want to see that, put it in the comments. In the meantime, we've gone about an hour, so let's call it there. Everyone, thank you for joining us on this video. This panel has been very interesting. Reminded me that some things exist and brought back some old memories. I hope this inspires somebody to go out and look for some new music at the vendor of your choice. Don't let the algorithm tell you what music to listen to. Or you can view the algorithm as today's word of mouth and buy everything it tells you to. It's all good.
Or go to YouTube and listen to whatever you want now.
Yeah.
Yes, we need a new name like RockTube or something like that. Everyone calls YouTube these little
ProgTube.
No, not RockTube. All right, so we'll be back with another Contrarians video soon. Thanks for joining us, everybody. Check out the Patreon, and we love having you on these videos.
Bye, guys. Thanks for having us.
Yeah.